The golden afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the palace library, casting dancing shadows across the ancient leather-bound books that lined the walls. King Alexander sat quietly in his favorite armchair, his weathered hands folded as he watched Princess Elena browse through the collection of historical texts. Her delicate fingers traced the spines of the books with genuine curiosity, something that had always impressed him about his son's wife. "Your Majesty," Elena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found the chronicles you mentioned about the ancient trade routes. The illustrations are remarkable." Alexander smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. There was something peaceful about these moments, away from the constant demands of court life and political pressures. Elena had always been different from the other nobility who surrounded them. She possessed an authentic interest in learning and understanding the history of Valdoria, rather than simply playing the role expected of her. "Come, sit beside me," Alexander said gently, patting the cushioned chair next to his. "Let me show you the passage about Queen Marlena's diplomatic missions. I think you'll find her approach quite fascinating, given your own interests in international relations." Elena approached carefully, her silk dress rustling softly against the marble floor. She had learned to appreciate these quiet conversations with her father-in-law, finding in him a mentor and friend she had never expected to discover within the formal walls of the palace. Unlike the rigid protocols that governed most of their public interactions, these private moments allowed for genuine connection and shared intellectual curiosity. As they bent over the heavy tome together, Alexander's voice remained low and thoughtful. He spoke of ancient alliances, of the delicate balance between neighboring kingdoms, and of the wisdom that came from understanding history's patterns. Elena listened intently, occasionally asking insightful questions that demonstrated her quick understanding of complex political situations. "You have such a natural grasp of these matters," Alexander observed, turning a page carefully. "Your perspective brings fresh insight to old problems. I often wish the council could hear your thoughts on some of our current challenges." Elena blushed slightly at the compliment. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I simply find it fascinating how the past can inform our present decisions. Perhaps if more people understood these historical precedents, we might avoid repeating the same mistakes." Their conversation continued in hushed tones, creating an intimate atmosphere of learning and mutual respect. Alexander found himself relaxing in a way that had become increasingly rare. The weight of the crown seemed lighter during these exchanges, replaced by the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge with someone who truly appreciated it. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in the royal chambers, Queen Isabella stood at her window overlooking the palace gardens. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman still beautiful despite the years of royal responsibilities, but her expression carried a sadness that seemed to deepen with each passing day. She had been searching for her husband, needing to discuss the upcoming state dinner arrangements, but the servants had informed her he was in the library again. Isabella knew exactly what that meant. For months now, Alexander had been spending increasing amounts of time with Elena, always under the pretense of discussing books or sharing historical knowledge. While she recognized that their conversations were innocent in nature, the frequency and duration of these meetings had begun to stir uncomfortable feelings within her. She remembered when Alexander used to share his thoughts and concerns with her, when they would spend quiet evenings discussing the challenges of ruling and the future of their kingdom. Those intimate conversations had been precious to her, representing a connection that went beyond their ceremonial duties as monarchs. Now it seemed that role had been transferred to Elena, leaving Isabella feeling displaced and forgotten. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting bustled quietly around the chamber, preparing for the evening's formal dinner. But Isabella remained motionless at the window. She watched the gardeners tending to the roses below, envying their simple, straightforward work that produced clear, beautiful results. Her own efforts to maintain harmony within the royal family felt increasingly complex and futile. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Your Majesty," called Lady Margaret, her most trusted advisor. "The kitchen staff requires your guidance regarding the seating arrangements for tomorrow's diplomatic reception." Isabella sighed quietly, turning away from the window. "Of course," she replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "I'll be with them shortly." But even as she prepared to attend to her duties, Isabella's mind remained focused on the scene she imagined playing out in the library below. She pictured Alexander's animated expression as he shared some historical anecdote, and Elena's appreciative smile as she absorbed every word. The image brought a sharp pain to her chest, a mixture of loneliness and something uncomfortably close to jealousy. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Isabella finally left her chambers to handle the dinner preparations. Each step down the corridor felt heavier than the last, as if the very air in the palace had become thick with unspoken tensions and shifting relationships. She passed the library door without stopping, hearing the soft murmur of voices within, and continued toward the kitchens with a determination that barely concealed her growing sense of isolation. The palace continued its daily rhythm around them all, but beneath the surface, the delicate balance that had maintained their family's harmony for years was beginning to shift in ways none of them fully understood yet. The great hall of Valdoria Palace buzzed with the controlled energy that preceded every state dinner. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the polished marble floors, while servants in royal livery moved efficiently between the long tables, adjusting silverware and ensuring every detail met the Queen's exacting standards. Isabella stood at the head of the room, directing the final preparations with the precision that had made her legendary among the palace staff. The Morellian ambassador should be seated here, she instructed, pointing to a position that would facilitate important diplomatic conversations while avoiding potential conflicts with the delegation from Astoria. And please ensure the wine selection reflects both kingdoms' preferences. Lady Margaret nodded approvingly, making notes on her tablet. Your Majesty's attention to such details always makes these events successful. The ambassador from Thessaly specifically requested to be seated where he might engage with Princess Elena about the cultural exchange program. At the mention of Elena's name, Isabella's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, she replied evenly. Princess Elena has become quite popular among our diplomatic guests. Her knowledge of international affairs seems to grow daily. The comment carried just enough edge to make Lady Margaret glance up from her notes. But Isabella had already moved on to examining the floral arrangements. Each centerpiece had been carefully designed to represent the unity between Valdoria and their visiting allies. But Isabella found herself critiquing every detail with unusual intensity. As the afternoon progressed, Isabella threw herself into the preparations with an energy that bordered on frantic. She personally inspected the menu, questioned the musicians about their playlist, and even examined the place cards multiple times. The activity helped distract her from the growing anxiety that had been building since yesterday's conversation with her sister-in-law, Duchess Margarita. Margarita had visited for tea as she did every Wednesday, but their usually pleasant chat had taken an uncomfortable turn when she mentioned seeing Alexander and Elena in deep conversation in the rose garden. They looked so serious, Margarita had observed innocently, almost conspiratorial. I do hope everything is well with young Prince David's military assignment. The comment had been casual, but it planted a seed of doubt that Isabella couldn't shake. David, Elena's husband and Alexander's son, had been away on a diplomatic mission to the eastern provinces for 3 weeks. His absence had coincided perfectly with the increase in Alexander and Elena's private meetings, a timing that now seemed more significant than Isabella had initially realized. Down in the library, Alexander was indeed deep in conversation with Elena, but their discussion focused on matters far more serious than historical anecdotes. Elena sat forward in her chair, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious concern. The reports from the eastern provinces are troubling, Alexander said quietly, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. David's letters suggest growing unrest among the mining communities. The working conditions have deteriorated, and there are rumors of organized resistance forming. Elena nodded gravely. David mentioned in his private correspondence to me that the local governors seem unable or unwilling to address the workers' concerns. He fears that without immediate intervention, we could face significant social upheaval. Alexander appreciated Elena's directness. Unlike many at court who preferred to discuss problems in vague diplomatic terms, Elena understood the importance of clear communication when dealing with serious issues. Her background before marrying into the royal family had given her insights into common people's struggles that proved invaluable in situations like this. I've been considering sending additional advisors, Alexander continued, but David believes that would be seen as a sign of weakness by the provincial governors. They're already resentful of royal oversight. What if we approached it differently? Elena suggested thoughtfully. Instead of sending advisors, what if we established a direct communication channel between the workers and the capital? Give them a voice that bypasses the local government entirely. The idea intrigued Alexander. It showed Elena's ability to think beyond conventional political solutions, finding creative approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than just symptoms. These conversations had become essential to his thinking process, providing perspectives that his traditional counselors often missed. "That's remarkably insightful," Alexander said, leaning back in his chair. "You have a gift for seeing situations from multiple angles. I wish I had advisors with half your understanding of these complex issues." Elena smiled at the praise, but her expression remained serious. "I just remember what it was like before I married David, when my family struggled with similar economic pressures. Sometimes the solution isn't more authority from above, but better communication between all levels of society." Their discussion continued, covering various aspects of economic policy and social welfare that would have surprised many court observers with its depth and sophistication. Alexander found himself genuinely excited by Elena's suggestions, feeling more intellectually stimulated than he had in years. As evening approached, the sound of activity from upstairs reminded them both of the approaching state dinner. Alexander glanced at the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and sighed. "We should prepare for tonight's festivities. But I want to continue this conversation tomorrow. Your ideas about the eastern provinces could be exactly what we need." Elena stood gracefully, smoothing her dress. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll prepare some additional thoughts based on David's latest reports." As they left the library together, neither noticed Isabella at the top of the main staircase, having finished her dinner preparations and coming to look for her husband. She watched them emerge from the library, noting the animated way Alexander gestured as he continued their conversation, and the attentive way Elena listened to his every word. Isabella's heart sank as she observed the easy familiarity between them, the shared understanding that seemed to exclude everyone else. Alexander hadn't looked at her with that kind of intellectual excitement in months, possibly years. She realized with painful clarity that what she was witnessing wasn't romance in any traditional sense, but something potentially more threatening to their marriage, a meeting of minds that left her feeling completely irrelevant. The queen retreated to her chambers before they could see her, needing time to compose herself before the evening's public appearance. As she sat at her dressing table, allowing her ladies to prepare her hair and makeup, Isabella stared at her reflection and wondered when she had stopped being the person her husband turned to for important conversations. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, beautiful but somehow diminished, playing a role that felt increasingly empty with each passing day. The state dinner unfolded with the practiced elegance that had become Valdoria's signature on the international stage. Diplomats from 7 kingdoms filled the great hall, their conversations creating a pleasant hum that mixed with the soft melodies from the royal orchestra. Isabella moved through the room with practiced grace, playing her role as hostess with the skill that came from decades of experience. Yet tonight felt different. Every smile required conscious effort, every gracious comment carefully constructed to hide the turmoil beneath her polished exterior. She watched Alexander at the head table, engaged in animated discussion with the Thessalian ambassador, his eyes bright with the same intellectual enthusiasm she had witnessed earlier with Elena. Elena herself sat several seats down, surrounded by younger diplomats who hung on her every word as she discussed trade relations with an expertise that impressed even the most seasoned negotiators. Isabella had to admit grudgingly that Elena had truly grown into her role as a royal family member. Her natural intelligence and genuine curiosity had transformed her from a nervous young bride into a respected voice in international affairs. "Your Majesty," said Ambassador Reginald of Morelia, approaching Isabella with a warm smile, "I must compliment you on tonight's arrangements. The attention to cultural details shows remarkable sensitivity to our various traditions." Isabella accepted the praise with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Ambassador. I believe that understanding each other's customs helps build stronger relationships between our kingdoms." "Indeed," Reginald agreed, then lowered his voice slightly. "I was hoping to discuss the proposed grain trade agreement with King Alexander this evening. Princess Elena mentioned earlier that she had some innovative ideas about transportation logistics that might interest us." There it was again. Even in conversations directed toward Isabella, Elena's insights seemed to take precedence. Isabella forced her smile to remain steady. Princess Elena has certainly developed a keen understanding of such matters. I'm sure the king would be delighted to include her in those discussions. As Reginald moved away, Isabella caught sight of Alexander rising from his seat. He walked purposefully toward Elena's section of the table, clearly intending to join the conversation she was having with several ambassadors. Isabella watched as Elena's face lit up when she saw him approaching, and how the other diplomats immediately made space for the king with obvious respect for what they expected would be valuable insights. Unable to watch any longer, Isabella excused herself from the main hall and stepped onto the moonlit terrace that overlooked the palace gardens. The cool night air provided relief from the warmth of the crowded room, but did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. She had worked tirelessly to make tonight perfect, ensuring every detail reflected Valdoria's commitment to diplomacy and cultural exchange. Yet she felt invisible at her own event. "Your Majesty?" Lady Margaret appeared at the terrace doors, concern evident in her voice. "Is everything all right? The Astorian Duchess was asking to speak with you about the upcoming royal wedding preparations." Isabella closed her eyes briefly, gathering her composure. "Of course. I'll be right there." But before she could move, she heard Alexander's distinctive laugh carrying from inside, followed by appreciative murmurs from the gathered diplomats. Through the open doors, she could see him standing beside Elena's chair, his hand resting casually on its back as he added something to their conversation. The gesture looked natural, almost unconscious, but it struck Isabella like a physical blow. When had her husband stopped touching her so casually? When had she stopped being the person he sought out in social situations? The questions tormented her as she returned to the dinner, plastering on her diplomatic smile and engaging with guests who praised the evening's success while she felt her marriage quietly crumbling around her. Later that evening, after the last diplomat had departed and the servants had begun clearing the great hall, Isabella found herself alone with Alexander for the first time in days. They walked silently through the palace corridors toward their private chambers, the clicking of Isabella's heels on the marble floor creating an oddly hollow echo. "The dinner was exceptional," Alexander said finally, his voice warm with genuine appreciation. "Ambassador Reginald specifically mentioned how impressed he was with your arrangements." "Thank you," Isabella replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I noticed you seemed particularly engaged with the discussions about trade policy." Alexander's eyes brightened. Yes, Elena had some fascinating insights about the transportation challenges. Her suggestion about establishing regional distribution centers could revolutionize how we handle international commerce. I'm amazed by how quickly she grasped these complex economic concepts. Isabella felt each word like a small wound. She has indeed become quite knowledgeable. "I've been thinking," Alexander continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension in Isabella's voice. "Perhaps we should establish a formal advisory position for her. Her perspectives could be invaluable for future policy decisions, especially regarding social and economic issues." The suggestion hit Isabella like a thunderbolt. An advisory position would formalize Elena's influence, giving her official status in the very areas where Isabella had traditionally been Alexander's primary confidant. "Don't you think that might be premature?" she asked carefully. "Elena is still quite young and there are protocol considerations." Alexander frowned slightly. "I don't see age as a barrier to good judgment." Elena's ideas tonight about worker representation were more innovative than anything I've heard from our traditional advisors in years. She understands both the common people's concerns and the international implications in ways that could really benefit our kingdom. They had reached their chambers, but instead of the comfortable intimacy that usually marked the end of such events, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Isabella realized with painful clarity that Alexander was not just praising Elena's intelligence. He was comparing it favorably to everyone else in his circle, including her. "I should review tomorrow's schedule," Isabella said finally, her voice barely steady. "The agricultural minister wants to discuss the harvest reports." Alexander nodded absently, his mind clearly still occupied with the evening's conversations. "Of course. I'll probably spend some time in the library working on the Eastern Provinces situation. Elena provided some excellent background information that I want to study further." As Isabella prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The confident queen who had commanded respect throughout the evening had been replaced by someone who looked lost and uncertain. For the first time in her marriage, she wondered if she was becoming nothing more than an ornamental figure in her own life, while the real partnership Alexander craved was developing with someone else entirely. The realization terrified her more than any diplomatic crisis or political challenge she had ever faced, because this was a problem she had no idea how to solve. Elena stood in her private study, reading David's latest letter for the third time. Her husband's words carried an urgency that made her heart race with worry. The situation in the eastern provinces had deteriorated significantly, with mining strikes spreading to 3 additional towns and reports of violence between workers and private security forces. David wrote that he feared for his safety and questioned whether the local authorities could maintain order much longer. The letter had arrived that morning, and Elena had immediately wanted to share its contents with Alexander. Their previous discussions about the Eastern crisis had proven invaluable in helping her understand the political complexities involved, and she trusted his judgment more than anyone else's when it came to protecting David's welfare. However, something had been troubling her about their recent conversations, a growing awareness that she couldn't quite put into words. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her lady-in-waiting with the day's correspondence. Instead, Duchess Margareta entered, her expression serious despite her warm smile. "Good morning, my dear. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I felt we needed to talk." Elena set down David's letter, immediately sensing the gravity in her husband's aunt's voice. Margareta had always been kind to her, serving as a maternal figure during Elena's adjustment to royal life. But today something felt different about her visit. "Of course. Your Grace, please sit with me by the window. Would you like some tea?" Margareta settled into the cushioned chair across from Elena, her elegant hands folded carefully in her lap. "Elena, dear, I've watched you grow into your role with such pride over these past few years. You've become a true asset to our family and to the kingdom." Elena felt a flutter of anxiety at the formal tone. "Thank you, Your Grace. I've tried to learn as much as possible and contribute meaningfully to our diplomatic efforts." "Yes, and that's precisely what I want to discuss." Margareta's voice remained gentle but carried an unmistakable note of concern. "Your dedication is admirable, but I'm worried about how your enthusiasm for learning might be perceived by others in the palace." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm as she began to understand the direction of this conversation. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Your Grace." Margareta leaned forward slightly, her expression compassionate but firm. "My dear, your frequent meetings with Alexander have begun to attract attention. I know they're perfectly innocent, focused on political matters and historical study, but appearances can be dangerous in a place like this." Elena's stomach dropped. She had been so focused on the intellectual stimulation of her conversations with Alexander, and so worried about David's situation, that she hadn't considered how their meetings might look to outside observers. "I never intended. We only discuss matters of state and David's reports from the eastern provinces." "I believe you completely," Margareta assured her quickly. "But Isabella is struggling with this situation more than you might realize. She's noticed the frequency of your private conversations and, more importantly, she's begun to feel excluded from Alexander's confidence in ways that are deeply painful for her." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Isabella had always been gracious and welcoming, showing Elena nothing but kindness and support. The thought that her actions might be causing the Queen pain filled Elena with genuine distress. "I had no idea," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "Queen Isabella has been nothing but generous to me. The last thing I would want is to cause her any unhappiness." Margareta nodded approvingly at Elena's immediate concern. "I know your heart, dear one. That's why I felt comfortable bringing this to your attention directly. Isabella would never say anything herself. She's far too proud and too committed to maintaining harmony within the family. But I can see the strain this is placing on her." Elena stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens where she and Alexander had discussed policy just days earlier. The conversations that had seemed so important, so intellectually fulfilling, now felt tainted by the knowledge that they were causing another woman pain. "What should I do, Your Grace? David's situation is becoming desperate, and King Alexander's insights have been crucial in helping me understand how to support him." Perhaps, Margareta suggested carefully, you could include Isabella in these discussions. She has decades of experience with political crises and might offer perspectives that would be valuable. It would also demonstrate your respect for her position and expertise. The suggestion made immediate sense to Elena. Isabella's diplomatic skills were legendary, and her understanding of international relations ran deep. Elena realized with embarrassment that she had fallen into the trap of assuming that because Alexander was king, he was automatically the best person to consult on every matter. You're absolutely right, Elena said, turning back to face Margareta. I've been thoughtless in my approach. Isabella's experience with similar situations would be invaluable, and I should have recognized that from the beginning. Margareta smiled warmly. I knew you would understand once it was explained. You have such a good heart, Elena. Now there's something else we need to discuss, the formal advisory position Alexander mentioned to several people last night. Elena felt another wave of anxiety. He spoke to me about that possibility, but I haven't given him an answer yet. I would suggest being very careful about accepting such a role, at least for now, Margareta advised. While your insights are valuable, accepting an official position might formalize a situation that's already causing tension. Perhaps it would be better to continue contributing your ideas through more traditional channels, at least until the current atmosphere settles. The wisdom in Margareta's words was undeniable. Elena had been flattered by Alexander's suggestion and excited about the possibility of having greater influence on policy decisions. But she could see now that accepting such a position while Isabella felt excluded could create permanent damage to their family relationships. I understand, Elena said slowly. I'll speak with King Alexander about redirecting our discussions to include Queen Isabella, and I'll decline the advisory position for now. That shows great maturity and wisdom, Margareta replied, rising from her chair. Remember, dear, this isn't about limiting your contributions to the kingdom. It's about finding ways to contribute that strengthen our family, rather than dividing it. After Margareta left, Elena remained by the window, David's letter forgotten on the nearby table. She thought about Isabella's kindness when she first arrived at the palace, how the queen had patiently taught her court protocol and introduced her to the diplomatic community with such grace. Elena had been so grateful for that support, yet somehow she had allowed herself to drift into a pattern that made Isabella feel replaced and unvalued. The realization brought tears to Elena's eyes. She had prided herself on her sensitivity to others' feelings, yet she had been blind to the pain she was causing someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. The intellectual excitement of her conversations with Alexander had been intoxicating, making her feel important and valued in ways she had never experienced before. But those feelings had come at a cost she was only now beginning to understand. Elena picked up David's letter once more, reading his words with new perspective. She would find a way to help her husband navigate the crisis in the eastern provinces, but she would do it in a manner that honored all the relationships that mattered to her. The challenge would be convincing Alexander to adjust their approach without making him feel rejected or diminished, while also reaching out to Isabella in a way that felt genuine rather than politically motivated. The path forward seemed more complex than any diplomatic negotiation she had ever witnessed, but Elena was determined to find a solution that preserved both her marriage and her relationship with the royal family that had welcomed her so warmly. Isabella sat in her private morning room, mechanically reviewing correspondence while her mind wandered to more troubling thoughts. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows should have been cheerful, but today it only seemed to highlight the shadows under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. She had slept poorly again, her dreams filled with images of Alexander and Elena deep in conversation, while she stood watching from an ever-increasing distance. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting Lady Margaret with the day's schedule. Instead, Elena appeared in the doorway, looking unusually nervous. "Your Majesty, I was wondering if I might speak with you privately about an urgent matter." Isabella's immediate reaction was surprise. Elena had always been respectful and cordial, but she rarely sought private audiences, preferring to handle most matters through official channels or during their weekly tea meetings. "Of course, Princess Elena. Please join me." Elena approached carefully, her usual confident bearing replaced by obvious anxiety. She sat in the chair across from Isabella's desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Your Majesty, I need your help with a situation that requires your expertise and experience. The request caught Isabella off guard. After days of feeling excluded and irrelevant, Elena's words carried an unexpected weight. I'm listening. Elena took a deep breath before continuing. David's situation in the eastern provinces has become quite serious. His latest reports indicate that the mining strikes are spreading, and there's been violence between workers and security forces. I'm deeply concerned for his safety, and I believe the situation requires immediate attention from someone with extensive diplomatic experience. Isabella leaned forward, her personal concerns temporarily forgotten as her professional instincts engaged. How serious is the violence? Are we talking about isolated incidents or organized resistance? David describes it as organized resistance with growing popular support, Elena replied, pulling out several letters from her handbag. The workers believe the local governors are ignoring their safety concerns and the mining companies are more interested in profits than worker welfare. David fears that without intervention, the situation could escalate into something much more dangerous. Isabella studied the letters Elena handed her, her experienced eye quickly identifying the key details that indicated this was indeed a crisis requiring delicate handling. As she read, she felt a familiar excitement building, the intellectual challenge of solving complex political problems that had always been one of her greatest strengths. This is indeed serious, Isabella said after reviewing the documents. The patterns suggest organized leadership among the workers, which means simple force won't resolve the underlying issues. David is right to be concerned about his safety, but pulling him out immediately could be seen as abandoning the people who trusted him enough to share this information. Elena nodded eagerly. That's exactly what I was thinking, but I wasn't sure how to balance protecting David with maintaining the Crown's credibility in the region. I was hoping you might have insights from similar situations you've handled in the past. The question sparked memories of several diplomatic crises Isabella had helped resolve during the earlier years of their reign, when Alexander had regularly sought her counsel on such matters. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she realized Elena was treating her as the expert she truly was, rather than as a ceremonial figure to be bypassed. There was a similar situation in the northern textile region about 8 years ago, Isabella said thoughtfully. The key was establishing direct communication between the Crown and the workers, while simultaneously putting pressure on the local authorities to address the legitimate grievances. It required very careful timing and messaging. Elena listened intently as Isabella outlined the strategy that had successfully resolved the northern crisis without bloodshed or economic devastation. The Queen's analysis was sophisticated and practical, demonstrating exactly the kind of expertise Elena had been hoping to access. Your Majesty, would you be willing to help me develop a comprehensive response plan? Elena asked. I feel completely out of my depth with something this complex, and David's letters suggest we may only have days before the situation becomes uncontainable. Isabella felt a surge of purpose she hadn't experienced in months. Of course, we should also involve Alexander in these discussions, but I think we can develop a preliminary framework that addresses the immediate concerns while establishing longer-term solutions. As they worked together over the next 2 hours, Isabella found herself impressed by Elena's thoughtful questions and quick understanding of the political nuances involved. The younger woman wasn't trying to demonstrate her own knowledge or compete for attention. Instead, she was genuinely seeking guidance and expertise. The dynamic felt refreshingly collaborative rather than competitive. I think we have the foundation of a solid approach, Isabella said finally, reviewing their notes. The key will be coordinating the timing so that David's safety isn't compromised while we establish these new communication channels. Elena looked relieved and grateful. Thank you so much, Your Majesty. I can't tell you how much this means to me. David will be so grateful to know that someone with your experience is helping to guide our response. Isabella felt a warmth that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction. Elena's appreciation seemed genuine and, more importantly, her approach had demonstrated respect for Isabella's knowledge and position in a way that felt healing after weeks of feeling dismissed. I suggest we present this plan to Alexander together, Isabella said. Your insights about the workers' concerns combined with my experience in crisis management should give us a comprehensive strategy he can feel confident implementing. Elena's face brightened with obvious relief. That would be perfect. I was dreading having to explain all of this myself, especially since some of the political implications are still unclear to me. As they prepared to seek out Alexander, Isabella realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with Elena. The young woman she had been viewing as a threat was actually someone seeking guidance and support, not someone trying to replace her. Elena's approach today had demonstrated both humility and respect that Isabella found deeply reassuring. When they found Alexander in his study, reviewing trade agreements, he looked up with surprise at seeing them together. "Is everything all right? You both look quite serious." "We need to discuss David's situation," Isabella said, taking the lead in a way that felt natural for the first time in weeks. "Elena has brought me some concerning reports, and we've developed what we believe is a viable response strategy." Alexander's expression grew attentive as Isabella and Elena took turns presenting their analysis and recommendations. Isabella found herself falling back into the collaborative rhythm she had once shared with her husband, while Elena contributed insights that enhanced rather than competed with Isabella's expertise. As they discussed the various options and considerations, Alexander looked between the two women with growing admiration. "This is excellent work," he said finally. "The combination of Elena's on-ground intelligence and Isabella's strategic experience gives us exactly what we need to handle this crisis effectively." Isabella felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. For the first time in weeks, she felt like an integral part of the decision-making process, rather than an observer watching from the sidelines. Elena's inclusion of her had not only solved an immediate problem, but had also begun to heal wounds that Isabella was only now realizing had been affecting her more deeply than she wanted to admit. 2 weeks later, the crisis in the eastern provinces had been resolved with remarkable success. The strategy developed by Isabella and Elena, implemented under Alexander's authority, had established direct dialogue between the crown and the mining workers, while simultaneously pressuring local governors to address safety concerns and working conditions. David had not only remained safe, but had emerged as a respected mediator between the various parties, earning praise from both workers and regional authorities for his fair handling of the complex negotiations. Isabella stood on the palace balcony that overlooked the eastern gardens, reading David's latest report with deep satisfaction. The young prince's letter was filled with gratitude for the guidance he had received and optimism about the long-term improvements being implemented in the mining communities. More importantly to Isabella, the letter specifically acknowledged her role in developing the diplomatic strategy that had prevented what could have become a violent uprising. "The evening air is lovely tonight," Alexander said, joining her on the balcony with 2 glasses of wine. His voice carried a warmth that Isabella hadn't heard in quite some time. "It is," she agreed, accepting the wine gratefully. "David's report makes for pleasant reading as well. The workers have returned to their jobs, the safety improvements are being implemented ahead of schedule, and the regional governors seem to have learned valuable lessons about listening to their people's concerns." Alexander settled beside her against the stone railing, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "The success of that intervention was remarkable, and it was due largely to your expertise. I had forgotten how skilled you are at reading these complex political situations and developing comprehensive solutions." Isabella looked at him with surprise. "Forgotten? I don't think my abilities have diminished over the years." Alexander's expression grew thoughtful, tinged with what might have been regret. "No, your abilities certainly haven't diminished. I think I stopped asking for your counsel as much as I should have. I got caught up in the daily administrative demands and somehow fell out of the habit of discussing the bigger strategic questions with you." The admission hung between them in the soft evening air. Isabella had not expected such direct acknowledgement of the distance that had grown between them, and she found herself uncertain how to respond. "I noticed that you had been spending considerable time discussing policy matters with Elena," Isabella said carefully, testing whether Alexander was prepared for complete honesty. Alexander nodded slowly. "I was. Elena has a fresh perspective that I found stimulating, especially regarding social and economic issues. Her background gives her insights into common people's concerns that I valued. But watching you and Elena work together these past 2 weeks made me realize something important." Isabella waited, sensing that Alexander was working toward a significant realization. I realized that I had been seeking new perspectives when what I really needed was to return to the partnership that made our early years of ruling so successful. Alexander continued. Elena's insights are valuable, but they're most effective when combined with your experience and strategic thinking. The crisis resolution proved that collaboration produces better results than any individual contribution, no matter how brilliant. Isabella felt a complex mixture of relief and lingering hurt. It did feel good to work on something substantive again, to feel like my experience was valued rather than simply acknowledged out of politeness. Alexander turned to face her fully. Isabella, I owe you an apology. I became so fascinated by Elena's enthusiasm for learning that I inadvertently excluded you from discussions where your input would have been invaluable. It wasn't intentional, but that doesn't excuse the impact it had on you or our partnership. The apology was more direct than Isabella had dared hope for. I appreciate you saying that, Alexander. I must admit there were times when I felt quite lost, as if I were watching our intellectual partnership transfer to someone else entirely. That must have been painful, Alexander said gently. I can see now how my behavior would have created that impression, even though it wasn't my intention. Isabella took a sip of wine, considering her next words carefully. Elena approached me 2 weeks ago in a way that surprised me. Instead of competing for your attention or trying to demonstrate her own knowledge, she genuinely sought my guidance and expertise. It made me realize that much of the tension I was feeling might have been my own insecurity, rather than any intentional slight from either of you. Alexander looked intrigued. How do you mean? Elena never tried to replace me in your confidence, Isabella explained. She was learning and contributing enthusiastically, which I interpreted as threatening when it might simply have been someone finding her place within our family structure. When she included me in solving David's crisis, I realized that she wasn't trying to compete with me, but rather to complement our existing capabilities. The insight seemed to resonate with Alexander. That's a generous interpretation and probably an accurate one. Elena has shown nothing but respect for both of us, and her recent approach to including you in important discussions demonstrates that she understands the value of experience and collaboration. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the distant mountains. Isabella felt a peacefulness that had been absent for weeks, not just because of Alexander's apology, but because of her own growing understanding of the situation. There's something else I want to discuss, Alexander said eventually. I had suggested to Elena that she might accept a formal advisory position, but she declined. She said she preferred to contribute through existing channels and collaborative approaches, rather than establishing an independent role. Isabella smiled at this news. That shows considerable wisdom on her part. Such a position might have formalized a dynamic that worked better as informal collaboration. Exactly, Alexander agreed. And it made me realize that some of my most valued advisors aren't those with official titles, but those with whom I have natural partnerships based on trust and complementary skills. The comment clearly referred to their own relationship, and Isabella felt a warmth that went beyond professional recognition. I've always believed that the best counsel comes from people who understand both the issues and the person making the decisions. Alexander reached for her hand, a gesture that felt both familiar and newly meaningful. Isabella, I want to return to the kind of partnership we had in our early years where we tackled challenges together and combined our different strengths to find the best solutions. Would you be willing to work with me on rebuilding that collaborative approach? Isabella squeezed his hand gently. I would very much like that, Alexander. I've missed having those kinds of substantive conversations with you, feeling like we were truly partners in both marriage and leadership. As they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella reflected on how the crisis that had initially seemed to threaten their relationship had ultimately led to important conversations and realizations that might not have occurred otherwise. Elena's thoughtful approach to including her had not only solved an immediate diplomatic problem, but had also created an opportunity for Isabella and Alexander to examine and repair their own partnership. The resolution felt genuine rather than forced, based on honest acknowledgement of mistakes and a shared commitment to moving forward more thoughtfully. Isabella realized that she felt stronger and more confident than she had in months, not because she had won some kind of competition, but because she had rediscovered her own value. and found ways to contribute that honored both her experience and her relationships with the people she cared about most. 6 months had passed since the resolution of the Eastern Provinces crisis, and the autumn diplomatic season was in full swing at Valdoria Palace. The great library, once a place of tension and misunderstanding, had been transformed into a collaborative workspace where Isabella, Alexander, and Elena met weekly to discuss policy matters and international relations. Today's session focused on preparing for the upcoming Regional Economic Summit, where Valdoria would host representatives from 12 neighboring kingdoms. The agricultural delegation from Thessaly has expressed interest in our new grain storage techniques, Elena reported, consulting her notes. They're particularly curious about how we've managed to reduce spoilage while maintaining quality during transport. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. That connects well with Queen Lydia's environmental initiatives. If we can demonstrate how our methods reduce waste while improving efficiency, it might open doors for broader cooperation on sustainability measures. Alexander leaned back in his chair, observing the easy collaboration between the two women with visible satisfaction. The combination of practical innovation and environmental consciousness should appeal to most of the attending delegations. Elena, your background research on each kingdom's current agricultural challenges gives us excellent starting points for meaningful conversations. The dynamic between the three had evolved into something far more productive than any of them had initially imagined. Isabella's diplomatic experience provided strategic framework and historical context. Elena's fresh perspectives and research skills brought innovative approaches to old problems, and Alexander's political authority allowed them to implement solutions effectively. Rather than competing for influence, they had discovered that their different strengths created a formidable team. There's one challenge we should address, Isabella said, turning to a new page in her planning notebook. The trade dispute between Morelia and Astoria is still unresolved, and having both delegations here simultaneously could create uncomfortable situations if we're not careful. Elena looked up from her documents. David mentioned in his last letter that he had some informal conversations with representatives from both kingdoms during his recent diplomatic tour. He might have insights into potential compromise positions that could help us facilitate productive discussions. Excellent suggestion, Alexander agreed. David's perspective as someone without direct involvement in their dispute could be invaluable. Isabella, what's your assessment of the underlying issues? Isabella outlined the historical context of the trade dispute, explaining how competing interests in maritime commerce had created tensions that went beyond simple economic disagreements. As she spoke, Elena took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of regional politics. What if we approached this as an opportunity rather than a problem? Elena suggested when Isabella finished her analysis. Instead of trying to keep the delegations apart, what if we created structured opportunities for them to engage with the summit's broader themes while addressing their specific concerns indirectly? Alexander raised an eyebrow with interest. Explain what you're thinking. Elena gathered her thoughts before responding. We could organize working groups around themes like maritime commerce innovation and regional trade efficiency. Both kingdoms would participate alongside others, so they wouldn't feel singled out. But the discussions would naturally address many of their core disagreements within a collaborative framework, rather than an adversarial one. Isabella's eyes lit up as she grasped the implications. That's remarkably clever. By focusing on shared challenges and opportunities, we remove the need for either side to admit fault or make concessions publicly. They can find common ground through practical problem-solving rather than formal negotiations, and Valdoria positions itself as a facilitator of regional cooperation rather than a mediator in a specific dispute, Alexander added. It enhances our diplomatic standing while potentially resolving a conflict that's been hampering trade throughout the region. The three worked together for another hour, refining Elena's concept and developing specific implementation strategies. Isabella's experience with similar diplomatic challenges helped them anticipate potential obstacles, while Elena's research into successful international collaborations provided models for effective working group structures. Alexander contributed his understanding of each kingdom's political priorities and the personal dynamics between their leaders. As their planning session concluded, Isabella reflected on how natural this collaboration had become. The initial jealousy and confusion that had marked her relationship with Elena seemed like distant memories, replaced by genuine respect and affection. Elena's intelligence and enthusiasm no longer felt threatening, but rather complementary to Isabella's own strengths. "I should mention," Elena said as they gathered their papers, "David has asked me to extend an invitation for you both to visit the eastern provinces next month. He's eager to show you the improvements that have been implemented since the crisis, and the Workers' Council has expressed interest in meeting the people whose strategies helped resolve their concerns." Alexander smiled. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity to see the long-term results of our collaboration firsthand." "I would very much like to make that trip," Isabella added. "It's one thing to develop policy from the capital, but seeing the actual impact on people's lives provides invaluable perspective for future decisions." As they left the library together, Elena walking between Isabella and Alexander, the scene would have looked perfectly natural to any observer. The easy conversation and shared laughter demonstrated a family unit that had found its balance, with each member contributing meaningfully to their collective goals. Later that evening, Isabella and Alexander sat together in their private chambers, reviewing the day's accomplishments. The renewed intimacy in their marriage had developed gradually but steadily, built on the foundation of restored intellectual partnership and honest communication about their individual needs and concerns. "Today's planning session reminded me why I fell in love with your mind as much as your heart," Alexander said, reaching for Isabella's hand. "Your ability to see the strategic implications of Elena's creative ideas and then develop comprehensive implementation plans is remarkable." Isabella smiled warmly. "And Elena's fresh approaches continue to surprise me. She has a gift for reframing problems in ways that reveal unexpected solutions. I'm grateful that we found a way to work together, rather than allowing misunderstandings to create permanent divisions. The three of us make a formidable team." Alexander agreed. "We should consider formalizing some kind of advisory structure that recognizes this collaborative approach, not to replace existing institutions, but to ensure that we maintain this kind of integrated thinking on important issues." Isabella considered the suggestion. "That might be valuable, especially if we design it to evolve as Elena's experience grows and as circumstances change. The key would be maintaining the collaborative spirit rather than creating rigid hierarchies." As they prepared for sleep, both Isabella and Alexander felt a deep contentment that came not just from personal happiness, but from the knowledge that they had navigated a challenging period with grace and emerged stronger both as individuals and as partners. The palace around them hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-functioning institution, but more importantly, it felt like a home where each family member had found their place and their purpose. Elena, in her own chambers, finished a long letter to David, describing the day's planning session and their upcoming visit to the eastern provinces. Her words were filled with excitement about the collaborative work and genuine affection for both Alexander and Isabella. The intellectual stimulation she had initially sought had evolved into something richer, a sense of belonging within a family that valued her contributions while challenging her to grow in wisdom and understanding. The autumn winds that rustled through the palace gardens carried the promise of continued change and growth, but now these changes felt like natural evolution rather than threatening disruption. The three people who had once struggled to understand their proper relationships with each other had discovered that the most satisfying partnerships are those built on mutual respect, complementary strengths, and the shared commitment to something larger than individual desires. In the months and years that followed, historians would note the innovative diplomatic approaches that emerged from Valdoria during this period, recognizing them as models for effective international cooperation. But the people who created those innovations understood that their real success lay not in any single policy achievement, but in their discovery of how to transform potential conflict into collaborative strength, creating a legacy that would benefit not only their kingdom but their family for generations to come.